Rachel said I'm a cognitive scientist, but I've been dabbling in archaeology or theoretical archaeology by working together with some people on the evolution of human cognition. And like everybody else, I'm interested in the evolution of language, but I've also been working on the evolution of causal cognition recently. And I did some work together with Anders Högberg, now a Swedish archaeologist, on evolution of teaching. And that would be my starting point, because my take today is that the evolution of teaching may give us some hints on what happened in the evolution of language. I'm not saying that teaching was the only source of language, but maybe it's an underestimated source of why we have the kind of linguistic communication that we have as humans. So let me start by giving you a brief introduction to a paper I wrote with Anders Högberg some years ago. And we divide teaching it's not a uniform thing, but we divide it into six levels. Can you see my arrow, by the way? I hope you can. Yeah. So there are kinds of teaching we find in other animal species, like facilitating, a cat mother bringing home a half-dead mouse to her kittens, and there are sometimes a feedback, very often in the form of aggression, when somebody is punishing you for doing the wrong thing. And then we have intentional feedback, which is more you think about what you're saying. I mean, if you positive and negative feedback. You have drawing attention, and we find some cases of that in animals as well, where they're showing where there is food to be found, drawing the attention to the young, making their young attend to the food. But I'm going to focus on the later levels here. I mean, that is demonstrating and communicating concepts, mainly demonstrating, and then more advanced forms like explaining relationships between concepts and narrating. Then we are getting very close to using language. So I'm talking about this mid stage because it's there we see the transition. So in this paper we analyze. Okay, I should say first of all that we find the first two stages in non-human animals, and then the rest so far we've only found in the hominins. I mean, it's kind of interesting that we don't see any clear cases of demonstration in other animals. There might be, but we haven't found very clear cases so far. Now, in the paper, we analyzed a lot of things. I mean, we looked at the intention of the teacher. I mean, when it's in the early stages, there are no intention. Evaluative feedback is to correct behavior, and you need joint attention, and you need a lot of things. I mean, I'm not going to go through this table, but just to want to show you that we have done a study of what's needed for the different kinds of teaching here. And then there is kinds of mind reading. So you need joint attention, and you need joint intention when you're demonstrating. And I'll get back to what I mean by understanding sign function here. And the most interesting is perhaps the communicative requirements. And you sign your signal whether you're positive or negative to things, even in the early levels. But then you get more advanced stuff. I mean, pointing is very rare in other animals, and I'll talk more about this demonstration in pantomime. And then we get up to displaced communication. That means talking about things that are not here and now. And of course, for narrating, you need a language or some form of more advanced communication. So this is the background. I mean, we started analyzing these levels of teaching, and we put them in this order because on each of these rows here, the requirements become stronger and stronger. And the argument is that as evolution proceeds, you can make more and more advanced things, but they have to build on the earlier levels. So that's the reason why we put the 6 different levels in this order. So let's go to okay. Why do I put in? Oh yeah. So Anders is a an archaeologist who specialized in stone napping, and then I heard that you in your department have a study on older one tools, and there is a speculation whether you can learn to nap these tools by only observation, or if you need some form of demonstration on how to do it. I mean, we know that chimps make tools and they use tools. I mean, for instance, they crack nuts with the aid of two stones. But there is no demonstration there. There is only imitation. They learn by observation only. And Anders has the argument, I mean, don't ask me to defend this argument here and now, that this idea of core maintenance, that is to keep the core in a shape that you can continue napping on it, that's difficult to observe directly. You have to understand it somehow. And one way of doing it is by the demonstrator marking in which order you perform the napping strikes and so on. So the argument is that already the older one tools require demonstration. You may disagree with this, but this is part of the argument that we put forward in this article. So let's go to demonstration, because that's the root of things. And demonstration is much more common than we think of in human life. I've given you two pictures here as examples, and I think that this is ubiquitous in human interaction, and it's underestimated in theories of teaching and learning and so on. But we see it everywhere. I mean, you demonstrate how to tie the shoes for your child and lots of things. So what is demonstration? Well, I have a simple analysis giving you 4 conditions. And of course, in demonstration, you actually perform the actions involved in the task, but you do it so that the learner attends to the series of actions. If the learner is looking away, then there is no point in demonstrating. But the intention of the demonstrator is that the learner can perceive the right actions in the correct sequence. I mean, if you're just doing something, if you're napping a stone and not concerned with the learner, then you're not demonstrating, then you're just doing, then you're just acting. And the fourth criteria, which is maybe the most interesting here, is as a demonstrator, you very often exaggerate the movements so that it will become clearer for the learner, and you slow down and make breaks sometimes in order to facilitate for the learner to perceive what is important in this sequence of actions that you're doing. So I'll get back to these 2 points of exaggeration and slowing as being kind of hallmarks of demonstration. So that's my criteria for something being a demonstration. Now, I want to compare that with pantomime. And pantomime is very similar, except for the first criterion, where the mimer performs the movements of the actions without actually performing the actions. So if you're napping a stone and you want some learner to make an older one tool, you can't make the older one tool, but you just have to show how it's done. Otherwise, you destroy the core, and that's no good for the learner. And for the rest of the conditions, they're the same as for demonstration. So the pantomime demonstration have very similar criteria, and the main difference, the crucial difference, is that in pantomime you don't really perform the actions. You make the movements of the hands or other body parts involved in the actions. So that's my distinction between demonstration and pantomime. Now, if you look at pantomime, it can be detached. That is, you can refer to entities not present in the environment. I mean, you may pretend that you have a key in your hand. I mean, showing somebody how to open the door to your apartment, even if you're not present, you have to show that you have to certain trick or something like that. So you can pantomime even if the learning situation or the demonstration situation is not just doing an action, not just a learning situation. So detached is what Hockett calls displaced. So I prefer the term detachment, but basically it's Hockett's idea of displacement, which he wrote about in connection with the evolution of language. And another important point is pantomime is a form of pretense. So a pretense involves a double perspective. You see your movement or the things you're working on as it is. But you can also see it as an imagined version. So I have this boy playing with a fire engine made out of a cartoon box, I think it is. So of course he sees that it's a painted box, but he pretends that it's a car. So pretense has this double perspective, and that's quite important, because if you're doing a demonstration, it's only one perspective. There's only the real things and the real actions. But in pantomime, you need to pretend. And you imagine the real action. I mean, you see somebody making a movement, but you don't see the action really being performed. And I'll get back to this notion of communicative sign function in a second. That is right now. So one of my ideas is that there are two functions of pantomime. And I've studied this for some time. So the first function is the teaching function, the action, the pantomiming action as an invitation to copy. You're the teacher, you invite the learner to copy your movements, but do it in the real situation, in a real napping situation, for instance. And in this sense, it fulfills what we call the communicative sign function. And that means that the teacher intends the pantomime to stand for real action. So the crucial words here are stand for. This is a representation. The pantomime is a sign in the Persian sense, and it stands for a real action. And of course, he also intends the addressee, the learner, to realize that it's not a real action, but it's something that stands for. So this has a sign function, and it's a communicative sign function. That's a first step towards real communication. Some of you may know about Grice's condition for the philosopher Paul Grice's conditions for communication, and this is a weaker form of the Gricean condition. But we find this kind of condition already in pantomime. And what happens then when somebody has pantomimed, the learner rehearses a napping or a cooking sequence or whatever is involved here, felling a tree or whatever, and then the teacher approves or disapproves. You give feedback. You evaluate the actions of the learner. That's the teaching use of pantomime. The other use is communicating. And that means you're not teaching somebody how to do something, but you're telling something. So this is the difference between showing something in the teaching thing and telling something in the communicating role. And that's a big difference, because you can communicate, you tell about an event, or maybe you can tell about a plan by pantomiming. But as I will try to show, I think this is a later stage in the evolution. It's more complicated cognitively and communicatively. And so my hypothesis is that we first had pantomime for teaching, and then that was accepted for the teaching function, for the communicative function. So let me compare. Okay, this is a small comparison here. We have imperative pointing and declarative pointing. Imperative is to ask for something. You point at something because you want it. Declarative is that you point at something because you want to have joint attention. You want to do something together with somebody else. You're declaring something about the pointing. And I think there is a bit of a parallel here between teaching and communicating. So here is my table of analyzing the differences between demonstration on the one hand, pantomime for teaching on the second hand, and pantomime for communication on the third. And I have here 6 criteria that we can use to distinguish these activities. So in demonstration, there is no sign function, but there is in pantomime for teaching, and there is, of course, in pantomime for communication. Detachment is this communicating about something that is not present here and now. And demonstration, you're doing something and it's here and now, and then of course you want the learner to do the same thing. In pantomime for teaching, you do the actions, but you may not have the tool in your hand, or there may be other factors missing. But if you go to pantomime for communication, then there is a lot of detachment. You can tell a story about what was happening a long time ago, and so on. The pragmatic form of these activities, that demonstrations is imperative. You want the learner to copy what you're doing. That's an instruction. Same thing for pantomime for teaching. But pantomime for communication is declarative. You're telling something about the world or about your plans. So this is why I make the distinct comparison with imperative and declarative pointing. It's the same kind of difference here. And they represent the action. You're showing the action here. Here you're representing the learner's actions. You're still doing a sequence of actions that you want the learner to perform. While in the pantomime for communication, you can mime other people, you can mime other things, and you can have a lot of roles as a mimer when you're telling a story in a pantomime. So you're leaving yourself as the actor, the only actor in the communication. Then perspective. You are doing the actions in demonstration. You are doing the actions in pantomime for teaching. But in pantomime for communication, you're very often telling about the actions of others. You take the perspective of other individuals. And in this, I talked about pretense earlier. There is none in demonstration. There is a bit of pretense in pantomime, but in pantomime for communication, there is extensive pretense. So as you can see, I mean, there is a kind of increasing levels of complexity on each of these criteria. And that's my main reason for saying that pantomime for teaching was first was primary from an evolutionary point of view, and then it evolved or developed into pantomime for communication. I think that's important to make this distinction between the two uses of pantomime. So that's the theory. Now I'm not an experimentalist, but together with a group in Poland led by Przemysł Siewiczyński, that's at the University of Toron. We made an experiment based on motion capture, and this is an article that's just appeared this year, so it's a fairly recent experiment. And to test these ideas of the differences between the demonstration and pantomime and so on. So what happens was that there was a motion capture study. The performers here were dressed up or filmed in a motion capture. And they were divided into 4 groups, and they all performed one action from different sports. Baseball, I mean, this you can see here, a baseball throw, a football kick, a foot bag. I mean, you're kicking a foot bag between your feet and doing all kinds of tricks, or a sword movement from kendo. So there were 4 different sports involved, and there were 4 conditions with these actions. The first condition was to learn to perform it. I mean, you were given instructions and you were watching movies, and you trained this action. You trained so you can perform it. And then you got into the condition where you would supposed to demonstrate the action to somebody else, so somebody else could learn it. So this is praxis. This is demonstration. And then the third condition was to pantomime the action without using the objects. I mean, each of these objects involved something else. I mean, a ball and a foot bag and a sword. So there was always a tool for this action. And in the pantomime, you didn't have the object. So this is a movie of somebody pantomime a baseball throw. And then the fourth condition. This is the pantomime for teaching. And then the fourth condition is our attempt to do the pantomime for communication. It's not a very, I should say, rich or complicated communication. But the only trick they were asked, or the only thing they were asked to do was to pantomime the action so that somebody else could distinguish it from another action. There were 2 actions showed, and the onlooker should distinguish the 2 actions from one another. So you had to perform the action, but you didn't have to be very careful. You were communicating that this is this is the one out of the two actions that you're referring to. It's a very simple form and low-level form of communication. But, doing experiments with motion capture and analyzing, and so it's very difficult. So this is where we ended up. And the results were quite good, actually. If you look at the article, you will see that it came out quite nicely. So actors really slow down and exaggerate their movement. When you performed a football kick or whatever, you did it at normal speed. But when you showed it to somebody else, in demonstration, in pantomime for teaching, you slow down the movements, you exaggerate certain parts of the movement and so on. We could see that very clearly by analyzing the movements in the motion captured in the films that came from the motion capture. And they were also partitioned. You made breaks in the demonstrations here in pantomime for teaching. While in the fourth condition, pantomime for communication, there was no significant exaggeration in the pantomime. So there is a difference between pantomime for teaching and pantomime for communication. And furthermore, there was no significant partitioning in the pantomime for communication. So we found some differences between pantomime for teaching and pantomime for communication. And we got support for this idea that actors do slow down and exaggerate when they are demonstrating and pantomiming. These results, the first here, were very clear, actually. So that's one experiment trying to test this theory. We need much more to be clearer about what's going on here, different kinds of actions and so on. There are some other people who have done some work in this area, but we did a new version where we had this distinction between pantomime for teaching and pantomime for communication in the background. Okay, that's the one experiment. Now we get over from pantomime to the rest of language. So pantomime doesn't come alone. I mean, we have other gestures. We have pointing gestures. And we use pointing to indicate location. That's the main role of pointing. Then we have different kinds of object gestures. You can show with your hand that something is rounded. You can show how big it is, how big the fish you caught is, and so on. You can show the length or height and maybe the weight and some other properties. Mainly visual properties we can indicate with object gestures. And then we have pantomime, as I've already talked about. But as you see, there are different reference of these gestures, location, objects, and actions. So I think that by combining pantomime with the other gestures, we can see this as a precursor to some form of linguistic communication, or at least symbolic communication. So my idea is that pantomime developed into communicative gesture. So you combined it with object gestures and pointing to form what can be called the proto-sign. I mean, I'm still focusing on the hands. I'm not talking about vocal uses, vocalizations and so on yet. I will come back to that. And you can see that pointing functions as a kind of proto-demonstratives, here, there, and now, and so on. And object properties, signs, gestures for object properties refer to objects and nouns or to adjectives. I mean, some kind of properties of the object. So they have correspond to these linguistic entities. While then, quite naturally, pantomime refers to verbs or proto-verbs. I mean, they are not linguistic, so we have to call them proto something. But anyway, you can see that by combining gestures, we can start combining information and in order to be able to communicate more complicated messages. So if we compare with animal communication, we find cases of ritualization. So here is I think it's a chimp mother, and there is the infant, and the infant makes a sign with its hand, and the mother understands. They've done this several times. It's become a ritual that the infant wants to be cuddled or maybe carried on the back. So they form through repeated interactions some kind of shorthand. At the beginning, maybe the infant was really trying to climb up on the mother's back, but then the communication sequence is shortened, so it's enough that the infant stretches out its hand for the mother to understand that this is what the infant wants. So this is what's called ritualization between two individuals in a group. Here is another case. This is called an A-frame. Two chimps are grooming each other's armpits, and they put these hands up to make it easier to find the right spots and so on. But that's also a ritualization that we find. I want to distinguish this from conventionalized communication. And that is normally in society. I start to use a sign, and then it spreads through the society, we presume that, I mean, the difference with a convention and a ritual is that in a convention you assume that everybody uses the same sign, and that means that your communication partners are replaceable. In an animal diet, you can't, the chimp infant can't go to another adult chimp and ask to being put up on the back, because the other adult will not understand the sign. There has no ritual established. But once you have conventionalized signs, then the communication partners are replaceable. And it's been shown that children follow this. When they've learned a word, they assume that everybody else uses the same word to talk about the same thing. And it's of course, as long as you are in a monolingual society, that works quite well. And if you meet foreigners, then the children are very confused because the conventions don't work anymore. But children are very good at picking up this idea that these signs, which we normally call words, but we can also use hand signs and so on, that mean the same thing for all the individuals in the society. And then we have, so the labels, the words or the gestures that children learn when they're learning a language, they think they are independent of the user. They think that the language exists on its own, so to speak, independent on who is using it. That's a mistake, but it's a very convenient assumption because it makes language learning much easier. If everything was a ritual, you had to learn everything in dyads, then things would become very, very complicated. And it also builds on some kind of joint belief, some kind of fairly advanced theory of mind, in the sense that when I use a word like apple, I mean a particular kind of fruit, and when you use the word apple, you mean the same kind of fruit. And I believe that you believe that I use it in the same way, and you believe that I believe that we use it in the same way. You understand that this is a fairly complicated, not an explicit but implicit assumption of language users, that we assume that when you're using a word, we are referring to the same kind of things. That's actually part of the definition of a convention, that it's based on joint beliefs of this type. So that's a step from ritualization in dyads to conventions in larger societies, and in particular when you're learning a communication system. And then, of course, one question is, if we started with pantomime, which is basically done with hands or other body parts, then we have turned somehow into a spoken language that's mainly spoken language. Of course, we have facial expressions, we have body movements and so on still, but it's dominated by the spoken modality. And one of the people who have written about this is Corballis. He's written a book called From Hand to Mouth. And he says that speech carries advantages over manual gestures, and then he gives some examples of what's beneficial by speaking rather than gesturing. It's not so good in some situations where gestures are still better. But anyway, overall, speech is more efficient than gestures. But Corballis doesn't really explain how the transition occurred. How did we go from a mainly mimed interaction to a mainly spoken interaction. I'm not claiming that vocalizations were never there. I mean, when you're communicating about animals and so on, it's very frequent to use onomatopoetic sounds, like you're imitating the animals and so on. So I think that there was always some kind of sound in the communication, in particular when you're referring to objects, not only gestures, but maybe also vocalization. So I have one idea about how this transition occurred from hand to mouth. And the idea builds on looking at prosody of an expression as pantomime. And I was inspired by the Canadian linguist Anne Fernald, who did a study of mother-infant interaction. And she wasn't interested in the words they were spoken. She was interested in the prosody. And she found that in various languages, I mean, her study has been extended to many languages. There are four basic patterns of prosody. One is approval. Good boy. It's going down. It's falling in tone. Then there is prohibition. No, 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 no. And it doesn't show very well here, but it's very often a staccato pattern. Even in the animal kingdom, a staccato pattern in a bird song or other animals is very often a warning call. Attention is by a rising tone of the rising pitch of the prosody. Can you get it? You go up at the end. Questions normally end by a rising tone at the end, and that's a kind of encouragement, attention grabber, and so on. And the fourth one is comforting, and that's very often an undulating movement in the prosody. So this is the first type of mother-infant communication. Before the infant understands any word, the infant gets the kind of prosodic patterns and understands emotionally. These are more or less emotional expressions. They're not referential. What the mother is communicating. So I have the idea. It's a wild idea, not very well tested yet. That vocal iconicity, in particular via prosody, and maybe onomatopoetic expressions as well, somehow is a metaphorical representation of actions. So in order to test this idea, I did together with two colleagues, we made a simple experiments where we had nonsense words, and we generated these words either with an increasing frequency or with a declining frequency. And then we presented these words with two videos. And in one of the video, there was a movement upwards. On the other video, there was a movement downwards. Different things, different kinds of movements. But then there were nonsense words. And the participants were asked to guess which word referred to, which video the word referred to, whether it was the one with the upwards or the downwards movement. And we found a fairly clear mapping that the words with downward frequencies were more often mapped with the downward movements, and those with upgoing frequencies were mapped with the up-moving videos. So there is some kind of iconicity in the prosody of spoken language. And not very many people have looked at the role of prosody in communication, but I think this might be a path to look further into when you're looking for transition between from gestural language to spoken language. We replaced hand movements with prosody movements up and down and so on. Maybe other features of prosody were involved here. So this is a speculation. We have this simple experiment giving a bit of support to it, but I think this is an area where we could do very many more experiments to study the mapping from gestures to prosody. Okay, that's an empirical case. Now, to sum up, I want to say something about what I see as the main step in evolution here. So I started with demonstration to pantomime, and then we extend the pantomime from a request that is for teaching to a communicative function. That is an extension of pantomime. And then pantomime was combined with gestures and covering other semantic domains, objects and directions and properties. And then there was the conventionalization of the components, and you get some kind of proto-sign system, a generative system. That's important. Okay, I should have said that pantomime is a generative sign system. You can pantomime very many situations, very many types of actions. So it's not just finite set of gestures. And then you have the transition that I just talked about from manual gestures to vocalization, and that might have been a very slow transition. I have no idea actually. And then finally, I haven't said anything about syntax, but you need that in order to make the expressions less ambiguous. You have to mark who is the actor and who is the recipient, who is the agent and who is the patient of an action. And in most languages, you mark that either by the order of words or by some kind of marking on the words there. So that would be basic syntax, but then of course language evolved. We needed many more types of expressions to make the communication less ambiguous. But I don't want to say very much about syntax here. So I basically end here by giving you a kind of diagram of how I think. I mean, the pantomime is at the center, and it came from demonstration. These two capacities were originally used for teaching, but then together with other forms of gestures that were combined into proto-sign that developed into proto-language, and which finally then turned into a full language, so to speak. There are two further aspects of pantomime that I haven't talked about, but I think from an evolutionary point of view, maybe from a cultural point of view, should also be studied. And one is the role of pantomime in ritual. I mean, very many rituals, religious and others, involve different kinds of pantomime. So that's another area where I think we could extend the role of pantomime. And of course, also in dancing. I mean, in very many cultures, people are miming in different ways in their dancing. You're adding a rhythmic pattern, and you're adding maybe social aspects of the pantomiming, several people doing things together. But basically, I think that pantomime had also an important influence on the evolution of dancing. So this I end with a rather wild speculation about how different components hang together. But for me, the core of it all is the role of pantomime in teaching and how it has extended in various other directions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for a really great talk. I'm sure we'll have some questions in a minute, either in the chat or people are welcome to unmute and ask out loud. I'll just read this one in the chat then. Can your algorithm be applied to the evolution of written language? Any ideas about how writing evolution? The evolution of writing, I assume.
No, this is an area I don't know very much about. I mean, I think it started with, I mean, we have the cave paintings, and they were pictorial. Then they evolved into some kind of conventionalized symbols. We have the cuneiform written texts. We have the hieroglyphs in Egypt and many other things. I mean, also in the Mayan society, there was an evolution of a written, but based on pictorial language. So in this case, I think that the pictorial representations were earlier than written languages. But I haven't said anything about pictorial representations. So there could be other systems. I guess we used calendars and other things in parallel with pictures. Calendars are supposed to be quite old as well, but this is an area I don't know very much about. So I'm sorry, but I have nothing more to say on this.
Thank you. I think, Larry, you raised your hand.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk, and that I think for us as archaeologists, a really useful framework to start thinking about how various technologies we know about, how they developed. I think as archaeologists, we're also almost obsessed with time. When did this happen? When did this happen? And as I was listening, I was wondering, as you move from the demonstration stage of pantomime to the communicative stage, could that be actually quite quick? Once let's call it the student learns, they then can move quickly to the you as a student, and also the student can move to the communicative stage. And then the next sort of logical question is, if that's fairly quick, is there any reason why conventionalization with a bit of sound might also be relatively rapidly developed and so on? I mean, we never know, but I'm just
No. I mean, I avoid I avoid talking about when this happened. I mean, the only reference point I gave you was the older one, the technology where I was claiming, or Anders, my colleague, is claiming that already then we had demonstration. And then there are people like Dietrich Stout, who studied Schurlian technology, and then he notices that you need to have sub goals in this planning, and that fits with what we call communicating concepts, because you have to know something about the platform construction. When you, for instance, when you're napping, you need a platform. You never see the platform. You have to understand that this is the function of the platform, and when you're napping a level of off lake or something like that. So there you need to get up a step higher than I've been doing here. I did the pantomime, the demonstration, the pantomime story, how we communicate concepts. But anyway, giving that, if we follow Dietrich Stout's analysis of the Schurlian, then you need to communicate concepts, and then you need to have a fairly elaborate communication system. I mean, you maybe not just pantomime, but object gestures or some other way of communicating. You need to communicate that something is poisonous, non-poisonous, edible, non-edible, I don't know what. And you can also start speculating about social structures when you look at the evolution of communication. One more small point is that the step from ritualization that we find in the great apes, and maybe in some other animals as well, to conventionalization. I don't know exactly when, but at some point of time, we established a society where the children stayed at home, at the home base, and they were taken care of. I mean, this is the grandmother hypothesis. They were taking care of the kids. The kids played together. The mothers were out collecting food and so on. And so if you have that kind of picture of a hominin society where the kids play together all the time, then it would be natural that the ritualized diets broke up, and you got a kind of communal system. So maybe this transition from a mother-infant bringing up to a communal childcare situation would be give some evolutionary pressure for the conventionalization process. But that's just a wild speculation on me from my point of view.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Finn, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it's in a similar archaeological vein, but what you said about the older one there, are you saying that the joint attention capacity of hominins at this point would be radically different from what we've seen in other primates?
It's still very much debated whether we find clear cases of joint attention in primates. What's his name? Levens claims that we find it, but Tomasello and Joseph Kull claim that we don't, and so on. Maybe Tomasello has moved a bit from joint attention to joint intention, and so on. So I don't know if there is a clear answer to whether we find it in the primates. Anyway, it develops quite early in human children, and it's necessary for language learning. I mean, if you're bad at joint attention, like some children with autism are, then your language learning will be impaired. So I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but of course we don't know what really drove the evolution of joint attention in the hominins.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. John, did you have a question? Sean, you're on mute still, I think.
The button didn't work.
Yep, there you go.
Okay. It's been a very enjoyable and thought-provoking seminar. Thank you. One thing that came to my mind, I suppose we archaeologists always do go back to the when.
Okay.
Chimps, chimps and gorillas seem to have very similar gesture sets, and some work has suggested that we have suppressed a lot of the gestures because we've switched to language. But if they have all those gestures in common, it would suggest that they were operating the gestures over maybe 10 million years in the background. And so I wonder, do you think there could be any element of pantomime that goes along with the gestures?
What's their name who studied gestures in that? Byrne and Tanner, I think, studied the gestures in gorillas. They found you have gestures for how the position of copulation. You have gestures of body grooming and so on. There is a repertoire. I'm not an expert on the repertoire, and some people claim that chimps have 25, 30, maybe even more different kinds of gestures. I don't know how to distinguish them. My impression is, though, that almost all of these gestures are about here and now. I mean, you want to do something here and now. And even the pantomime in the early stage that I was talking about, and when you're showing somebody how to nap an older one tool or whatever, I mean, it's about here and now. You have the material there, but you can't do the napping yourself because then you destroy it. Somebody has to learn it. And so you show the movement, but then the learner is supposed to do it almost at the same time. I mean, you don't go home and sleep overnight and then practice the day after. You do it while you're there. And so this idea of the detachment of pantomime, when you come to pantomime for communication, you tell a story about how the hunt went yesterday, or what if we want to build a hut tomorrow. I mean, what should we do together, and so on. Your communication becomes displaced, as Hockett calls it, or detached, as I call it. I think that's a basic change from the gesture system of the other primates.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, I'll just read the one in the chat. This is from Kelly. I wondered if you have come across any examples of the exaggeration in demonstration/panto, either in the archaeological record or ethnographically with hunter-gatherers, etc.
I think that if you go ethnographically, you would find lots of examples. I haven't studied that myself. Archaeologically, you can't. I don't know if you can see any. I mean, in the napping stories, if you can see any differences there. I mean, you can't. If you look at the flakes that come out from a napping sequence, you will. I don't know if you can ever tell whether that was done in real action and real napping, or whether it was done in a teaching situation. That would be very difficult to tell. If you're lucky, you might find a particular situation. I know that my colleague Anders Högberg has studied a cave in Clan Williams in South Africa, in the Cape Province, where it's clear that the master sits inside the cave and does the napping of the hand axes, while the apprentices sit outside the cave. I mean, you can tell from the flake structure there that there are differences where you sit. I mean, and the master is definitely sitting inside the cave. But that doesn't show anything about the exaggeration or anything like that. So I think it would be very difficult to distinguish a situation where there is teaching from one where there is not.
Do we have any other questions in the last few minutes? I'll just wait for a moment and see if anyone types on. Oh, Johan says, where next for your research?
I would like to develop this idea about the iconicity. I mean, I have some linguists to work with here on this idea that prosody maps onto, or metaphorically maps onto the movements. That's one reason, one area. But I'm also working on causal cognition together with Marlies Lombard, a South American archaeologist, and we still have a lot of things to develop in that area. So yeah, no, I mean, I continue in these two main areas, I think.
Great. Does anyone else have any last things they want to ask? Okay, yeah, I can't see anyone typing, so yeah, if that's everything. Yeah, I guess we'll end it here then. Okay, thank you everyone.
Yeah, thank you everyone.
Thanks.
For listening and for your comments, questions.